2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Who would have thought that in the space of a couple of days, horse racing, the Opera House, our state politicians and our Professor of Politics, Jim Joseph, would all be talked about in the same segment. But good morning, Jim. That is exactly what we're doing this morning.
Yes, it's listeners are probably aware that there's been a bit of a controversy over the use of the Opera House to advertise a horse race, which is attempting to get some prominence. And there's also been a bit of a contretemps on air last week. The Opera House management said no, not this particular form of advertising, and the Premier overrode them. What's interesting about this is the sort of the politics that's involved here, because in putting this into the context of how voters view politicians and how they feel about that representation and whether they can trust politicians to look after the wider community interests or whether they're just in it for themselves or their mates or whatever, that particular perception with this incident now gets reinforced in a way, because there are processes in place by which the Opera House decides how to use its facilities, and there are also conditions around being a World Heritage Site that the Opera House has to take into account and the management has to work through. So in that context, we have the custodians of the Opera House making those decisions. There's also a provision for the government to say, well, hang on a second, we think X should happen, and they can, as they have in this case, override those decisions. But what that signals is, if we move away from this particular case, the rights and wrongs or the pros and cons, and just think about, okay, that's this one. Now we have a precedent that any organisation that desires to advertise and use the Opera House as part of that advertising and to broadcast their message on the sales can now expect, or perhaps have the opportunity to get the government of the day to simply overrule whatever the Opera House management decide is appropriate. That's a pretty dangerous precedent, because there's no real means of drawing the line as to what form of advertising, what entity is appropriate or not appropriate. It may be that the thin edge of the wedge was started way back with seemingly innocuous things being put on the sales. But now with a particular commercial concern such as the racing industry and its close connections to both political parties, we have a situation now where it's much more stark. The problem for future governments is going to be twofold. One is the issue of trust, that people say, well, it's just a matter of, if you've got enough money, you can get your own way, and the politicians will bend to that and they won't listen to the broader community should there be a difference of opinion there. But the second thing also is that there is now pretty well no limit as to what might be done, and that's a worrying precedent. That's irrespective of whether we think the Opera House itself should be part of commercial projections and part of commercial activities. There's a sense in which it already is, insofar as it's an iconic landmark, and it sort of is emblematic, if you like, of Sydney. If you think of Sydney, you think of the Opera House. It's a global recognition, and in that sense, the tourism industry has an advertising mechanism all in itself, just for the building itself. But what we're seeing here with the particular controversy, Mark, is that the building itself is no longer, no longer a particular entity. It's itself being transformed into the message for whoever wishes to pay for it.
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head a little while ago when you said that the die was kind of cast a long time ago, when we've seen all sorts of messages put on that particular building. Like New Year's Eve happens, other festivals like Vivid, for example, is one that comes to mind. There's another side of this that says, all of the people that are all outraged by this. The time you've spent outraging, it's just a message that's gone up, and by the time you blink, you miss it, kind of a thing. Should we really be worried about the fact that somebody's put a message on a board on the side of the Opera House when there's so many other things that our politicians should be spending their time on, and now they've got bogged down in something that is really so little?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that one can say in response to that. One is that some of these other messages are part of an artistic presentation, and one might argue just how arty it is, but that's another matter. Secondly, is the more important issue, I think, of the government of the day overriding the decision of the management of the Opera House to manage it in a way consistent with the conditions both of its World Heritage listing, but also in the conditions around making it symbolic of what it actually stands for in the first place. And then there's a third issue where we saw this spill over into the federal sphere, where the Prime Minister weighed in. And from a federal state perspective, that in itself is a little worrying, because premiers more often than not guard their territory, as it were, very jealously, and for prime ministers to weigh in. On this particular instance, the Prime Minister weighed in and agreed with the Premier. But again, the issue is, yes, you weighed in on this one and you agreed, but suppose the next time around
when you don't agree.
You don't agree, and then you've got a dispute between the state and the federal government.
Oh, well, that's easy. Their response then is, well, look, that's a state matter, so I'm not going to comment on that because that's a matter for the state.
Well, in many respects, one might have expected that diplomatic response from the Prime Minister. So in response to the question you raised, I think that in the first instance, it's probably something that the Opera House and perhaps the wider community need to say, well, this is what we want of our Opera House. And yes, we're happy for advertising to go on it, or no, we're not. And then take that stand one way or the other. If it's decided that there's not to be advertising, then I think they have to pull back and not go down the path of, oh, well, that's not really advertising, that's just an artistic statement. Because it is open, I think, for advocates of the current advertising issue to say, well, it's an artistic statement in its own right. And then you're, in all sorts of trouble trying to figure out where it's to go. So I think the big issue, though, as far as I'm concerned in terms of political analysis, is the message that goes out to voters is that governments will intervene, apparently, if you've got enough influence and support, which basically reinforces the lack, shall we say, the sense of distrust and the sense of, well, why are we voting if you don't listen to us at the polls? If you're not representing the wider, the people on a wider community basis, then what's the point?
I think you might be right, Jim. We'll follow this as well as I guess it's almost a series now. How can we trust politicians? I guess if they'd have said no to this, I'm always happy to wear a hat or a shirt for the right amount of money. I would have worn that with a horse race. So what about you?
I try to avoid that, but
the cash is right, Jim. If the cash is right.
The cash may never be right, Mark.
Alrighty. Thank you, mate. We'll talk to you next week.
My pleasure.
Our Professor of Politics, Jim Jose, on 2NURFM.